Topic 4, Women and Slaves, Virtue and Vice. So before we begin, I should say something that my students always say. Invariably, a young woman in my class will ask, how come you put women and slaves together? And I always say, I didn't put women and slaves together. The ancient world put women and slaves together. But what I'd like to do in this topic is talk about society, if you will. We've been talking so much about men, and we talk about women when we talk about goddesses. But what about the everyday woman? What about the people that we don't hear from? We hear about women and children. We hear about slaves, but we rarely hear from them. And so what we're going to try to do here is really difficult, because what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to hear the whispers, the marginalized, and try to understand as much as we can, even though the sources are skewed, because what we have are men talking about women and slaves by and large. We're also going to talk about virtue and vice. And the reason I put these together is because social principles like loyalty and authority and stoicism are part of what people valued. It's part of what men wanted their women, their wives, their mothers, to teach to children and grandchildren. And so the irony, of course, right, is that we don't hear so much about these women, and yet in any culture, in any society, at any time, women are always the first teachers. And so if boys are supposed to grow up to be good Roman citizens, where are they going to learn that? Well, for the first few years, they're going to learn it more at their mother's feet than their father's feet. And where do their mothers learn about it? So we're going to focus in. When we study women in ancient Rome, it's very similar to women in the ancient world in general. We have these standardized gender roles, the cliches, the stereotypes. And I want to bring up two Latin words that were used to describe women in this period: pudicitia and univira. Pudicitia was a word that was used to describe the ideal woman. A woman was supposed to be faithful and fertile. A woman's place was barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen, largely. Though we do have examples of upper-class women who were at least informal advisors to their husbands. If you've studied ancient Greece, you know the famous Aspasia, who was a common-law wife to Pericles. And we all know that very frequently in a society where men dominate, women play a significant role. Let's think about Mrs. Roosevelt. What would the Roosevelt administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt have been without Mrs. Roosevelt, who was really traveled for him because he was restricted because of the polio? She plays such an important role. But of course, getting a hold of specifically what women said to men, that's difficult. Univira literally means a one-man woman. Vir is the word for man, a virile person, a manly person. Uni, one, and then an A at the end is the feminine form in Latin. So a woman is supposed to be a virgin when she is married. She is supposed to be faithful to her husband alone as they are married. And ideally, she is supposed to be a widow who does not remarry, though we have many examples of women who, in fact, remarried. But this is an example of having the ideal that we lay out, and then you see how reality measures up against it. Women operated, though women, at least middle-class women and certainly upper-class women, tended to be literate at a higher rate, though still relatively low numbers, than Greek women. They still operated, even the most powerful women, the wives and mothers and daughters of emperors, let's say, in the social context of what's called paterfamilias. And paterfamilias is the father of the family, but on a big scale. So let's see. Think of your own family and think of the person who, in modern terms, may be female, who is not necessarily the oldest, but is the wisest, is the one who runs the family. If you get engaged, that's the person you tell first. If you're expecting a child, you tell that person first. And if you don't, you're in some trouble. If you go to a wedding or a social event or a wake, that's the person pretty soon, if not the first, one of the first you have to go and show respect to. In earlier cultures, kissing a hand or kissing a ring, perhaps. So to give you an extreme example of a pater familias, I'm going to give you the two presidents George Bush. There was George H.W. Bush, who was the vice president to Ronald Reagan and then elected in his own right in 1988, and his son, George W. Bush, elected in 2000, re-elected in 2004. In the Roman system of pater familias, the son, George W. Bush, while President of the United States, would have been under the authority of his father. Now, his father, as an ex-president, wouldn't have had access to the nuclear codes. I'm mixing my chronologies here, but you see where I'm going. Nevertheless, let's say George W. Bush was not married, or Mrs. Bush had died, and he wanted to remarry. Even though he was President of the United States, George W. Bush would have had to seek the advice and consent of his father, the former president. I think that's a big example, but it shows you the power of that father. So men and boys were under the authority of their pater familias as well, but eventually they would rise and move out of that shadow and become leaders on their own, whereas women never could escape the context of pater familias, though for a widow, let's say I am pater familias and my daughter is married and her husband dies, I'm going to be able to give her a level of protection. So it's not just about control, but it's protection as well. Let's talk about names, because names tell us something about where women fit. If you look up on Wikipedia, for some reason, a name of a Roman, you'll get the fanciest thing. So you type in Cicero or Cicero, as they may have said, and you'll get Marcus Tullius Cicero. Marcus Tullius Cicero, who is he? They had three names, a praenomen, a nomen gentillicum, and a cognomen. A praenomen is our given name, your personal name. So in my case, Christopher. Marcus in the name of Cicero. Then there's a name that we don't have, a clan name, the nomen gentillicum. In his case, Tullius. So it's the head of that clan who would be the pater familias, the father of the family. And then the cognomen, or the last name, what we might call the surname, which is the branch of that clan, in his case, Cicero. Women, however, did not get three names. Women got one name only. Now, you may know a name like Livia Drusilla or something, and that's something that historians use to delineate this Livia from that Livia. Sometimes what they do is they take the name of her mother and they append it at the end so that we can distinguish this person from that person. If everyone's named Tom, we're in trouble, so we add 1, 2, 3 after their names, or Junior, that kind of thing. So women basically had one name, and it was a feminine form of their father's name. Doesn't that also tell us something about women? So, for instance, Julius Caesar, whose name was Gaius Julius Caesar, his daughter was the feminine form of his name. Therefore, her name was Julia. And when she married, she might pick up her husband's cognomen or last name, but very often they didn't even use that last name. Again, it's something historians use. How is this different from Greek society? Well, there's something called free marriage, and it's a little hard to understand what free marriage meant, but we believe that even though we had this system of pater familias, that in certain families that you at least had the tradition of a free marriage, meaning that at least the woman's opinion was asked when they were trying to figure out who she should marry. That's different than calling a girl to you when she's 7 or 11 or 14 and saying, you're marrying so-and-so. This was not the case in Greek society. We have some examples of it in Roman society. Relatively speaking, a jump, not a huge jump from a modern perspective. Dowries followed a woman. Now that's kind of interesting because it means that a woman doesn't own the money. In modern terms, she couldn't write a check, but her dowry followed her. So she had a dowry, and the dowry went to her marriage. Her husband dies. His family doesn't own her dowry. She goes back to the protection of her pater familias. The dowry comes with her. And women in Roman society could sue for divorce. Now, they weren't legal agents. They essentially had to hire a man to speak for them. But in Greek society, no way could a woman divorce. In Greek society, a man could divorce his wife for no reason whatsoever. Whereas in Roman society, a man had to show cause to divorce his wife, and a woman could divorce her husband with cause. With cause. But women are often considered dangerous. And obviously, this is related to menstruation and then menopause. We have all sorts of examples of dangerous, out-of-control women. And if you look very closely, sometimes those out-of-control women are sometimes around the age of 45 or 50. It's menopause is what it is. And there have been all sorts of studies that show that a woman at the time of menopause throughout history is often considered crazy. There's a wonderful word that's used called distracted, wonderful in its oddness, and that women around the age of menopause in various times in history have particularly been targeted as witches. And one of the reasons is that a postmenopausal woman, if she's alone in life, she may become a midwife as a way of surviving. And women in all cultures are often put in charge of funerary services, caretakers. So here you have women who are working at the beginning of life, birth, midwives, and at the end of life, burial, and those are thresholds, aren't they, between this world and the next. And so those women who tended to go into those professions around the age of 45, 50, around the time of menopause, get labeled as witches, perhaps, at that period of time. And so sometimes men try to legislate against these out-of-control women. There was one law called the Oppian Law, the Lex Oppia. And what happened was that the men thought that the women were showing off too much. These are what are called sumptuary laws. Sumptuary laws deal with the clothing that you wear. So in the Middle Ages, for instance, in certain towns, women of a certain only women of a certain class could wear a certain color or long flowing robes. It's conspicuous consumption is what it is. And so look at me. I have the money that I can buy this expensive blue cloth because that was especially expensive, and others couldn't. So the notion was that women were dressing up and being a little too flashy. And that law, the Oppian Law, named after, of course, a man, said that women couldn't dress ostentatiously. And then that just didn't work. After about 20 years, it was repealed. And then another incident that we talked about earlier, the Bacchanalian or Dionysian conspiracy in 186 BCE, when the senators, men, legislated to try to outlaw the feast of Dionysius or the Bacchanalia because they didn't want women operating outside the context of male oversight. Slavery. Now, when we think of slavery, we think of American slavery. And in the ancient world, slavery was not racial. You think slavery, you think American slavery, and immediately you think race. They didn't. It was really ethnic. So in Greece, my city-state beats your city-state. I, therefore, am superior. You, therefore, become a POW. And so it tended to be more ethnic. Now, we also have to make distinctions because in the American South, most slaves were what were called field hands, unskilled labor, but then there were also house slaves in much smaller numbers who were considered skilled laborers, and there were some slaves who also had skills. That's a little bit closer to the ancient world. Certainly somebody had to build the aqueducts, had to build the roads, and many of them were slaves, yes, but sometimes the architects and the engineers were slaves as well. So in the Roman world, you had skilled and unskilled labor, and sometimes in the Greek world more than the Roman world, but sometimes in the Roman world too, you had temporary slavery. And of course in the American South, you're born into slavery, you die into slavery. It's very, very rare for you to be manumitted or handed your freedom. And the Romans believed what the Greeks believed when it came to slavery. That is, it was the state of nature. And they're following Aristotle there. Aristotle said, some should rule and others should be ruled. And that's just the way it is. Men are bigger than women, Aristotle says, and women are built to have babies. Men are not built to have babies. Women are the lesser sex, the fairer sex. He says their skin is lighter, they should be inside, whereas men are rougher and can be outside. And so Rome's greatness is built on the sweat of slaves and on, in some ways, the demeaning of women. And yet, the comparison, the ironic comparison between the treatment of women in slavery and the holding up of social values and principles, virtue and vice, may clang in our ears, may sound, wow, this is really a dichotomy here that doesn't work for me. And yet I think putting the dichotomy together is instructive, because who among us is not a mystery? We always work as oxymorons, don't we? We want to believe that we are one way and we act another way. So too the ancient Romans. So let's look at what they valued. What were some of their social principles? Loyalty, absolutely. Loyalty to the paterfamilias, loyalty to the state above all. And a deference to authority. Authority has an interesting root. Auctor means actor, but it doesn't mean a man playing a character in a Shakespearean play, a woman playing Virginia Woolf on stage. That's not what it means. It means, like when we say an historical actor, a player, somebody who is taking action in the scene of the world, in politics, in military affairs, in economics, in a legal case. And so auctoritas is the bearing, the carriage of that person. Charisma is a way of looking at it. And that person was due a certain deference, a certain obedience. And one of the reasons why that auctor deserved obedience was because he practiced mediocritas. Now, here's an example of a Latin word that just doesn't work when you think what you just thought. I said mediocritas and you thought mediocrity. How was the meal? It was okay. It was mediocre. It wasn't good. It wasn't bad. It was fine. That is not mediocritas. Mediocritas is highly valued in the Roman system. It's related to the word medium. It means you don't get too excited about things. You don't get too down about things. You keep a steady level. You're on an even keel. Psychologists will tell us, never make a decision when you're down in the doldrums, but also never make a decision when you're at the top. Those aren't the times to make major decisions. Let time pass. See the best and the worst of the top and the bottom and make a good, solid, in-the-middle decision. Pietas is a word that we came across when we studied religion and mythology. Piety, yes, but more deference to the authority of my elders and of the gods. And it was also used in this phrase, filial piety. A filius is a son, a filia is a daughter. So filial piety is the duty and respect that you pay to your father, grandfather, paterfamilias, but also to the state. Because aren't you a child of the state? So it's the duty and respect to family and the state. And there's a great value placed on tradition. Do you remember I said that the Romans weren't innovators? Do you know people who they have to run out and have the first version of any new toy, any new gadget, they run to that store. And as soon as that particular gadget goes into a new version, 2.0, 3.0, they have to have that. If it's new, they want it. The Romans were exactly the opposite. They were very distrustful of new things. They were very conservative. Don't think about that in an American political context. Think of literally you want to conserve what you have. You don't want to risk too much. And the word they used for that is traditio. Now, traditio is actually first a business word. It means a business transaction. So It refers to a trader, T-R-A-D-E-R, not Benedict Arnold, T-R-A-I-T-O-R, a trader. In other words, I have a good, you have a good, we barter, and we hand it over. And then in a cash economy, you give cash and I give you the good. I give you the product. And so tradition is what one generation hands down to the next generation. And in this case, it hands down its values. The irony being that it's usually the woman who is the first person handing down the tradition, handing down and handing down. And what they're handing down is something known as the mos maiorum. Mos, in a different Latin form, is mores, M-O-R-E-S, which is something we say social mores. It's still an odd word. We don't use it a lot. The mos maiorum. Custom maiorum, of the major ones, of the better ones. So you look around and you say to your children, don't act like that person. That person is cheap. That person is weak. That person can't stand up in difficult times. Look at that person. That is the better person. That is the better model. When you have difficulties, you want to act like that hero. And how is that hero acting? Steady. He's following authority. He's practicing mediocritas. And there are two big philosophies of virtue that talk about how you act in certain circumstances. One is called Epicureanism, and the other is Stoicism. Now, nowadays, when you say Epicureanism, it usually relates to fancy food. Somehow that connection was made. People who watch the Food Network a lot are epicures. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking here about a Roman philosopher named Lucretius. And Lucretius lived at the very end of the Republic. He dies in 55 BCE, so just a decade before Julius Caesar will be assassinated. And interestingly enough, remember I talked about the fascination and the love-hate relationship with Greeks? He uses two Greek words to describe this philosophy. So here he is saying, oh, everyone is saying the Greeks are materialistic, and yet adopting two characteristics, two Greek words. Ataraxia means tranquility. Someone once said, oh, I wish our times were more peaceful. And I know someone else who responded, our times will never be peaceful. You have to be peaceful in the midst of the madness. That's ataraxia. Apatheia. That's not apathy. Oh, our students today, they're so apathetic, they don't vote in elections. Apatheia is not apathy. It's not being controlled by your passions. It's having a steady head, making good decisions with your brain. Pleasure, he says, is the absence of pain. It's a pretty low bar. And maybe the most famous phrase that comes from Lucretius, listen to this. When man is, death is not. When death comes, man is not. Well, you can't get bolder than that, huh? Except maybe to say, nothing is sure except death and taxes. When man is, death is not. And then that time will pass. When death comes, man is not. In a Hebrew tradition, this would be to everything there is a season, a time to be born and a time to die. Stoicism is, of course, the big philosophy, and I think Stoicism gets a really bad name. People today, when they say so-and-so is stoic, they tend to mean a cold fish, and they usually use it to describe first responders, policemen, firemen, EMTs, paramedics. Those people are not cold fish. They're in control of their emotions. Think of Thanksgiving. So somebody cuts their thumb. Somebody always cuts their thumb on Thanksgiving. There's someone in your family who says, okay, well, let's just put a little, ice on it. Let's see. Maybe we don't have to go to the hospital. Let's take it easy. Let's relax. And there's the other person who says, oh, my God, we got to go to the hospital. We have to go to the emergency room. When all it needs is a Band-Aid. Okay? The first person is stoic and the second person isn't. The first person is feeling, but is not allowing those feelings to run out of control and is asking people to stay calm. Zeno and Cicero were the two most famous Stoic philosophers. And one of the best things that a Stoic can be is a rhetor, someone to speak, someone who will speak with passion, yes, with style, yes, but also with substance, a measured, considered, thoughtful response to a situation to persuade people what is the best for all. These are Roman values.